What is veganism about? There's been some debate in the vegan community about how to interpret the widely accepted definition of veganism.
That veganism, ethical veganism as I see it, is a minimization to the highest extent practicable of all forms of animal suffering.
Why is he using the word suffering? Veganism is not about suffering, it's about rights violations, exploitation. Why are you bringing suffering into this?
I use the phrasing reduce suffering, and I guess that is probably the principle I align with more.
In this video, I'll offer my perspective that I hope will help to reduce infighting in the vegan community and strengthen the rhetoric of vegan arguments. To the question of whether veganism is about reducing animal suffering or securing animal rights, I answer neither. Now, I don't want to come off as an enlightened centrist, and I certainly don't want to fall victim to the middle ground fallacy. Let's start by examining the source of the disagreement on the definition of veganism. The most commonly cited definition of veganism is the definition from the Vegan Society, which states that veganism is a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of, and cruelty to, animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. There are a few things that are vague in this definition. Consider the word exploitation. The term exploitation is at the heart of what veganism is. It's an ethical philosophy against the exploitation of animals. But the word exploitation can be vague. Exploitation is commonly defined as the act of selfishly taking advantage of a group in order to benefit oneself. At first glance, this is pretty straightforward, but things become less clear when we consider why exploitation is even a bad thing in the first place. What is it about taking advantage of someone that makes exploitation a moral wrong? The source of our confusion comes from the fact that there are multiple valid answers to this question. For example, you could argue that exploiting someone is wrong because it will result in consequences that are bad for that individual. This is a form of consequentialism, which is a moral theory which evaluates the morality of an action based on the consequences that it produces. You could also argue that exploiting someone is wrong because it violates that individual's rights, such as the right to life. This is a form of deontology, which is a moral theory that evaluates the morality of an action based on its adherence to a set of moral rules. There are other moral theories to consider like virtue ethics, but in this video we'll just consider these two. If you ask a consequentialist what veganism is to them, they will probably tell you it's about a reduction in the suffering they cause to others, whereas if you ask a deontologist what veganism is to them, they will probably tell you it's about respecting the rights of others. Despite these differing perspectives, both parties will tell you that veganism can be defined by the definition we covered earlier. Is one of them incorrect? Well, no, because the vagueness of the definition allows for both perspectives.
Now, the Vegan Society includes the term exploitation. I think this is potentially quite a vague and unhelpful term because it itself is a term that has myriad definitions. So I'll stick with suffering.
Isn't vagueness something we want to avoid in our definitions? Doesn't it benefit the movement to have a definition which leaves no room for interpretation? Also, no. Because the spirit of what veganism is has nothing to do with the question of deontology or consequentialism. Veganism is about moral scope. Moral scope refers to the set of entities that are considered to have moral status. For example, someone who is racist may have a moral scope that is restricted to human beings with whom they share similar racial characteristics. Someone who is speciesist may have a moral scope that is restricted to human beings and which excludes other beings who are not human. The question of moral scope is entirely independent of deontology or consequentialism. As an example, take the deontological moral rule, do not kill. This seems pretty straightforward, but we could just as easily ask, do not kill whom? Who are we not supposed to kill? Different deontologists would give you different answers to this question depending on who their moral scope includes. Deontology and consequentialism tell us what to do with moral subjects, but they do not tell us who those moral subjects should be. Similarly, veganism does not tell us what to do with moral subjects. All it says is that whatever our moral framework is, its scope must include non-human animals. Veganism asserts that animals have intrinsic moral worth, and we must respect that by eliminating practices which fail to take their best interests into account. When we exploit animals, we are acting against their best interests in order to pursue our own interests, like profit or pleasure. We are excluding their interests from our moral scope.
So I'll stick with suffering.
Alex, the way that you've changed the definition is what causes the problems. Exploitation is pretty easy to understand. It is the use of another individual rather than their equal treatment. So Kant would define exploitation as treating an individual as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves.
In the case of animal farming, we are completely erasing their most existential interests, the desire to continue existence, the desire to not be tortured, the desire for autonomy, for the sake of our most trivial interests, usually a temporary experience of sensory pleasure. The only way to correct this injustice is to genuinely consider the interests of animals in our moral systems, whatever those systems may be. This doesn't mean that we can't still argue about which moral theory is best. We've been doing that for centuries, and we won't stop until everyone agrees. With me. But we don't have to put veganism into the crosshairs of these arguments. We can disagree while acknowledging that we agree on what's important, that everyone's voice is heard, including the voiceless. Concepts like consequentialism and deontology are abstract, whereas veganism is a very simple and clear idea that species should not be the boundary at which our consideration ends. It benefits veganism not to have to worry about the complexities of moral theory because we don't have to get bogged down in conversations that detract from the heart of the issue. Whatever moral system someone has doesn't matter. All we have to do is convince them that such a system must recognize the intrinsic moral value of animals. There's one more thing that I want to address. So far, this video has been about the definition of veganism and how it relates to moral theories. I haven't said anything about the practical concerns of adopting rights-based or suffering-based campaigns in our movement. On the level of an individual conversation, we're going to want to adopt arguments based on the assumptions that the other person holds, and similarly, on the level of the entire movement, we're going to want to adopt campaigns that are likely to have a significant impact on the systems we're trying to change. For this reason, even though I personally lean towards consequentialism, I still advocate for animal rights. That's because I live in a society where human rights are enshrined within laws and institutions. Considering this, I believe that it makes the most sense to seek the extension of that concept to other animals. There are other important considerations to make, such as the lives of wild animals, but that will have to remain a topic for another video. Until then, thanks for watching, and make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below so that we can learn from each other on these issues. I make videos about sustainability, futurism, and animal rights, so if any of those topics interest you, make sure to subscribe. But until then, peace out.